It's been more than 7 weeks since the pro-Palestinian encampment went up at King's College Circle on the grounds of the University of Toronto, as Canadian student clubs began to join the wave of campus protests that started at American campuses in late April. At the U of T, the last convocation ceremony was held on Friday. School's done for the summer, but the protesters show no sign they're going home. In fact, they held a breakfast and a walking tour yesterday, and they listed a whole week of programming coming up, including tattooing, map making, and a film screening. Last week, the University of Toronto's lawyers were in court arguing why a judge should grant a permanent injunction to dismantle the encampment. They claim the encampment is illegal and it's trespassing on private property, and that irreparable damage is being done to the school's international reputation. Also, that the slogans and signs and some of the programming coming out of the fenced-in encampment have crossed the line into hate speech and anti-Semitism and is causing harm for the university's Jewish pro-Israel students and faculty, and also others who may not be Jewish but are pro-Israel. The student protesters want U of T to divest of any financial ties with Israel, boycott Israeli academics, and reveal all the school's endowment holdings. Their lawyers argued the encampment should stay open because the right to free speech and free assembly trumps the university's concerns. The CJN's been reporting a lot on these encampments, and as we wait for the judge's verdict, we felt it was important to get an eyewitness account of what these encampments are all about, including the U of T's, and who's actually running that one, and why some of the protesters are Jewish too.
I think it's very careful also to, in fact, display that there are Jews that are part of that resistant voice. They've in fact made a point of saying, there are Jews that are part of this movement, and over tried to say, not only are they part of it, but like, hey, media, don't you dare, ignore that.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Monday, June the 24th, 2024. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News.
I can't date women right now because I'm too busy calling myself a piece of shit.
I had a dysfunctional Jewish mother and I had a dysfunctional Native mother.
I had 25 full years of utter struggle and failure.
I started to realize the absurdity of my inability to let go of this monster of guilt.
Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Hi, I'm Ralph Benrig. I'm the host of Not That Kind of Rabbi, where we look at people's spiritual journeys and take a little time for their self-reflection, and maybe yours. You can get it all at thecjn.ca/NTKR or wherever you get your podcasts.
To date, there have been about 12 similar tent encampments from BC to Halifax. Half are still up. The rest were cleared quickly, some with police help, like York and the University of Calgary. In Oshawa, Ontario Tech University was the first and only school that agreed to have its encampment dismantled peacefully when the school reached an agreement that will give the students more say in any investments which the school has with pro-Israel companies or businesses, and the school agreed to try to bring in more Palestinian students from overseas to study. CJN reporter Jonathan Rothman has been covering the U of T's Occupy for Palestine encampment, and he's been permitted inside several times, even though he clearly identified himself as working for the Canadian Jewish News. Admittedly, he was made to feel uncomfortable while just doing his job. Jonathan joins me now to give us his take on what he's seen there, what it sounded like, and what to expect next.
Thanks, Ellen. Thanks for having me here. Great to be here.
You have been our point person at the U of T Toronto St. George encampment for the past 7.5 weeks. When the encampment first started, it was not the first one in Canada to start. The first one in Canada was in McGill, wasn't it?
Correct. There were encampments at McGill, UBC, and I believe University of Ottawa before the U of T one started on May 2nd at about 4 a.m. when the protesters were able to sort of get by a section of fence that I believe is the section that later became the gate. So that fence had been erected to actually prevent the encampment from getting set up, and they've been able to mount signs to it and banners and kind of have the advantage of controlling that space. And when I spoke to organizers, one of them told me that if the university were simply to remove that fence, that would put them in a lot of danger from counter-protesters and agitators that they say have come and have been the ones to threaten and aggravate against them.
Okay, let's talk about that. So you work for the Canadian Jewish News, and I'm underscoring the word Jewish, and you have a press badge that you wear. Were you able to actually cover it, and what was their reaction to you?
I've noticed that sometimes people some notice, some don't, some look and have a reaction, some don't, to a press badge around my neck that says the Canadian Jewish News and has my photo and my full name. And the reason I mentioned that is in contrast to most, if not, a large percentage of the protesters, both inside and outside the encampment gates, often do have their faces covered, whether it's a mask or, a keffiyeh scarf. And so there would occasionally be, a look or a glance, or if I had to characterize it, I would say sometimes people don't know what to, you're in the middle of this heated Israel-Palestine protest kind of situation. And people are sort of looking at me and going, "Oh, well, I think I know which side you're on," or "I think I know." And I should.
Did
qualify.
they actually block you from coming in? Was there kind of like an interrogation? And I say that in a gentle way.
I have been hearing reports of that, and we've seen reports of that happening at the gate. I can't say that it was my experience, however. I did go with a media badge. But the first time that I'd gone was it was the second day of the encampment, and it was actually, it turned out it was Shabbat, that the Jews inside the encampment were doing Shabbat, and I didn't know that at that moment. But when I went to the gate and I presented the badge, I did sense that there was at first a sort of a question. One question was, is there a media liaison? Like, is someone around to receive this person? And it seemed at first like maybe not, and maybe I was just going to sort of be stuck at the gate. One of the people who is a Jewish supporter of the encampment, who teaches at a different university, was also nearby at the gate and knows people from my family, and had I had sort of a bit of a, not the protexia thing, but like the Jewish connection thing. It was a thing too, and that person ended up being who called the media representative, the media liaison from the left-wing coalition that's called Jews Say No to Genocide, and they're very active inside the encampment. And so that was who essentially vouched for me. And so that's sort of the system that they say that it operates on. And there was a media circle that there was a sign posted there saying, meet up and sort of wait for your media rep here, or maybe, you might do, TV crews might do their interviews often there, or other people. There were people coming in for the Shabbat, and I didn't know that, but they were just sort of like, hey, I'm here for the Shabbat. Whether it was If Not Now or one of the groups that's part of the Jews Say No coalition. And I was kind of like, what's the deal? Oh, some people are just like trickling in. Like, I didn't know the Shabbat code word, and I sort of was like, oh, I should have just done that instead of, but that was
we have to be ethical and transparent, not cool.
That was a passing thought, of course. Yes, don't use it. Anyway.
You mentioned some of these groups, and you mentioned some of them are Jewish. Can you walk us through who is in that group? What are the cast of characters?
The group that seems to have taken the lead is calling itself Occupy UofT for Palestine, and one of the media reps for it is Aaron Mackey, who's a fourth year or maybe just graduated political science major, and that's the representative who I did have some one-on-one time with. There's also, in terms of two of the sort of leading Jewish groups that are involved, there's the Jewish Faculty Network has been a group that's supporting the encampment and has been supporting kind of the pro-Palestinian or the Palestinian cause over these months, even before the encampment. And I spoke with a woman named Deb Cowan, who's a professor of geography representing the Jewish voices supporting the encampment. And the other group that's been supporting it is that coalition, the Jews Say No to Genocide coalition, made up of very typically Israel critical or anti-Israel Jewish groups, Independent Jewish Voices, United Jewish People's Order, If Not Now, which seems to have been one of the groups that was more involved in hosting the Shabbat, at least the first time when I went on May 3rd, on the second day there. And there are some other sort of Jewish members of social justice groups like Showing Up for Racial Justice Toronto, things like that. So it's a coalition that came together, I believe, in November. That's been very present in the these black T-shirts and black with white text branded T-shirts and hats that have been out protesting. They've been part of sit-in protests at Union Station, and they've been part of this encampment as well. And I spoke to one of their members, Jonathan Brown Gilbert.
I haven't heard any Palestinian or Arabic sounding names.
Yes, we have heard from, well, I don't know for certain about all the organizers, but there are a few of the media representatives and at least one person that I heard at the rally on May 27th when it was pouring rain and the 8 a.m. deadline passed and all the labor union folks came out and said, if the police come and try to take down the encampment, we'll put our bodies on the line, and, labor's going to stand up for the Palestinian cause and for this encampment and their right, the students' right to protest, etc. And so while everyone was getting soaked, there was at least one person, and I actually found that to be one of the most compelling speeches I heard was a young woman named Mariam Khatib. Her family is from Gaza, and I found that connection most compelling from her speech, where she sort of said, the least I could do is pitch a tent. And there were a few other Palestinian speakers, and I know that of the protesters who are part of the Occupy UofT for Palestine circle, I know that at least a few of them have referenced Palestinian or Arab background connections. There was a lot of talk about, are they all students? How many of them are students? Which ones are not students? What I can say is that the protesters time and time again have said, no, this is a student-led movement. We're all students, or almost all of us are students, or something like that. So, it can be difficult to parse the he said, she said of this, especially with, as Jonathan Brown Gilbert pointed out to me, it's a really decentralized group. There's not necessarily a huge, there's not what they necessarily consider a central leadership. The people who go into the negotiations with the university, the people who come back and relay what was discussed in those meetings and maybe relay that as the media representatives at all those press conferences, they're still talking, sort of trying to, it sounds like, from people like Deb Cowan that I spoke with, that they try to find consensus, with the whole, like, okay, is this what we're doing as the encampment group? But it also sounds pretty amorphous to me.
Yeah, there were a lot of them named in the injunction suit. A lot of people, especially politicians and especially from the American side in the United States encampments, but also here, have said it's organized, it's got to be organized, it's too professional, the signs are up too quickly. It's money coming from Iran, from Hamas, from ties to terrorist organizations and Samidoun. And what, if anything, did you see or feel when you were there about how this is getting funded?
They actually do seem quite organized. But I can't say that I saw any evidence of outside funding or organizing. You would have to be there 24/7 to have a sense of who comes and goes. I think they take donations to, get food deliveries, things like that. What I would say, though, is that on a different note, there's really, it seemed like, at least for a while, there was a lot of a monitoring system from, people sort of almost at outposts around the circle of the outside circle of the encampments. And I had, even one woman tell me that she and her friend were sort of followed and sort of stalked. And then they eventually turned to this, young man who had sort of like she described it as sort of having a ninja mask or sort of following him around on a bicycle. Another person, and even one time when I went by after a counter protest had dispersed, I sort of noticed that there was an element of people sort of following, other people that might not, to make them sort of feel unwelcome, that was my sense anyway, around the track or rather around the road that encircles the encampment. I noticed that there was at least some pattern of sort of keeping on top of who's in the space around the encampment.
Were you at all able to see whether there was anti-Semitic, hateful Holocaust denial or anti-Jewish rhetoric, signs, anything that you saw that you said, wait a minute, this is crossed the line?
If you can get past sort of that plausible deniability smokescreen, then yes. If we're not going to pretend that red triangles don't mean what red triangles mean, then yes. We heard a lot at the beginning about phrases either written in chalk on the ground or called out at protests that would say, about Intifada, or there was a sign, glory to the martyrs, and that representatives from the protesters' side pushed back on, because a Jewish professor had said, hey, I feel really threatened when I see glory to the martyrs. Like, this is a reference to Shaheed. I don't like seeing these references to Intifada. I have a friend who, I lost a friend, or a friend who lost a brother in the Intifada, something. And it's not theoretical to me, and definitely, there's a lot of messages that were definitely hostile to Israel, to Zionism, to the idea of a Jewish state being a legitimate thing. I think it's deliberately trying to avoid being anti-Semitic, and there would be maybe a chant or a message on, I believe it was a chalk message on the ground about go back to Europe in the early days. And Jonathan Brown Gilbert, one of the Jews in the encampment, had a story about how he saw that and was very disappointed and was getting ready to talk to the encampment organizers about, this is really not cool. And by the time he got there, it had already been taken down, and that person had been essentially dismissed from being welcome at the encampment. So the organizers would often point to that, and to, for example, the chant, all Zionists are racists, all Zionists are terrorists. And so, Deb Cowan had said to me, hey, we made sure that chant, that message also, was no longer okay at the encampment. So they made a point to say, hey, we don't condone anti-Semitic messages. I mean, other than being offended by the amount of what I understand red triangles to mean, and that being a kind of unapologetic factor, and spelling Intifada with the red triangles, and that doesn't seem to be very equivocal to me. That doesn't seem to be ambiguous to me. But at the end of the day, I can't say that I saw specifically egregiously anti-Semitic messaging or language or heard chants. So,
I mean, what about that kid who was on a scooter that said that Hitler was the OG? He was a gangsta. You
right.
guys, I wish I'd killed all of you.
They disavowed him immediately. They said, we've never seen that guy before.
Yeah. But it's attracting fringer people than they would have liked. Is that what you see that? And that's including in the Jewish community too.
I think it's fair to say that that's an element. Yeah.
Because I know people, for example, are very proud on social media. They went down and served slices of watermelon from the Jewish community. Or blasted music at 4:00 in the morning to try to early on. I mean, this is part of the Jewish reaction.
I ran into that young man with the watermelon, the Gishmak Herring kid,
Jeremy Urbach,
on May 5th, and that was right after sort of, I think, what was probably maybe the first big counter protest of that kind when the Israel Now, formerly linked to JDL people, had been down there.
In terms of things that didn't make it into your stories, I'd love to hear some of these vignettes that remain with you that I would love you to share with our listeners.
This was one. We've made our message clear. We are a movement of students that is diverse and following a just cause, and they are here to wave flags for a fascist state. So there was a lot of really, when there was those counter protest situations, there was a lot of antagonism there for sure. And the protesters often said, when these sort of far right Zionist agitators, as they would call the, Israel Now linked people, they would say, hey, this is who's coming down and calling us, is it capos or capos, or calling us, saying we're not Jews and calling us these things and, spewing anti-Semitism at us. I was also really marked by, there was one night I was coming from, the office, and there was a girl on the mic, like a child, and I don't know, maybe she was 10, and the chant was about Israel, Israel, how many kids did you kill today? There are moments like that sit with you where you're trying to find the humanity in absolutely everybody's perspective on this, and you understand where maybe that kid and that message is coming from. And at the same time, like, it's very difficult to sort of drop in and then kind of go, oh, well, actually, I need to go home to my family now. And that was like the last thing I heard at this protest, and at the same time, like, that's what they say that they're there to do, that they're there to create a discomfort, and that they're there for that discomfort to provoke a change that they're demanding from the university, then that they've been so far, I guess, pretty successful in. We'll find out from the injunction hearing in the coming days, but so far they've been able to stay there for over 6 weeks, and it was several weeks ago already since I remember at one press conference where they said, we live here now. So
do you see any signs where they have medical tents, they have doctors, they have fresh water, they have latrines? Like, how do you live on a quad for 7 weeks?
I know that there is a kind of a library or learning tent. I think there is a food tent, and that they are quite organized about that. I think that originally there had been, in fact, when I went on May 3rd, I took photos of, there were some sort of like portable structure, privacy screens around, like kind of a latrine setup, but I don't think that lasted. And I think that the university had made some of the buildings in the area washrooms available. I know that protesters were often using Heart House facilities, both going to the cafe and using the washroom and things like that. But it seems like they've got a functioning community one way or the other. I mean, the question is, who can be part of it, I guess.
Okay, and
the protesters often say that when people aren't let in, it's not because they're being asked if they're a Zionist or they're being asked anything about this, that, or the other, but that if it's perceived that they're going to be a disruption or an agitator, that it's based on safety. That's what their message has been over and over again about who is let in. We've heard reports of people saying, well, I went with a kippah and they didn't want me to come in, or
professors and donors and whatever. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So that wasn't my experience.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. I'm looking forward to hearing more as we wait for the judge's verdict.
It's a pretty fascinating series of questions around whether that right to free speech and to assembly and protest that the encampment is standing behind can continue to restrict the space the way that it has been, in what, even the encampment's lawyers recently said, it's essentially a public park. It's essentially like a public space. which several people have also reminded everyone that had not been accessible for several years because of various kinds of work, and is now the majority of it behind that fence. Convocations come and now gone, with banners congratulating, both banners from the university on parts of the fencing, congratulating the graduates, and homemade banners from the protesters commemorating those in Gaza who never got to graduate. So it's a really stark and vivid picture of a protest that it's just remained a question mark of what's going to happen.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily. At least 5 other encampments are still up, although most schools, like the U of T, are trying the legal route to get rid of them. Like McGill tried to get the police to help enforce a trespass notice, but that city's police say they won't get involved unless something really dangerous happens, and the Quebec judge hearing the case has so far sided with the protesters. Although last week the McGill president said enough was enough after the encampment launched a kids' summer camp that would be teaching revolutionary tactics. Until now, the Toronto judge has also ruled there was no urgency to clear out the protest camp at U of T because convocation could and did go ahead. The CJN Daily is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman. Our executive producer is Michael Freeman, and our music is by Dov Beck-Levine. Thanks for listening to the CJN Daily.
Y'all remember that joke from Airplane? The old lady asked for some light reading.
How about this leaflet, famous Jewish sports legends?
But in actuality, that's changing. Jews are crushing it in sports around the world, and we are here to celebrate them.
Sandy Koufax gets his 10th strikeout.
Zach Hyman, his first career hat trick. 41 points for Diddy Avdia. It's Sue Bird's building.
I'm Gabe.
And I'm Jamie.
We love Jews and we love sports, but most of all, we love kvelling over Jews in sports.
Together we host Menschwarmers, the longest-running Jewish sports podcast in the world. Listen and subscribe at thecjn.ca and wherever you find your podcasts.